Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, I'm going to go over this week's affixes in Mythic Plus, along with some tips for adjusting and a heads up on some of the difficult situations coming your way. I'm shooting this video at the Dark Moon Fair, where you'll probably be spending your downtime this week fishing, since it's going to be a healing intensive week. This week is Fortified, Bolstering, Grievous. Being a fortified week means it's likely we'll see some high keys timed, and Grievous is an affix that can be difficult, but overall doesn't slow down the pace of the dungeon too much. Bolstering, however, is a rough affix in some dungeons, forcing you to pull smaller than you otherwise would want to, and making accidental chain pulls deadly. During a week like this, I like to prioritize mostly single target healing power, but add in a bit of single target damage when I can to help with bolstering. This is a week I would describe as reasonable for time, but also difficult to execute. Grievous is an affix that is almost entirely dependent on the healer. DPS players can definitely do some things to make it easier, but overall this is something they probably won't be thinking about much. As a healer, you need to be focused much more on healing this week and less on damage, considering if you don't top party members right away, they'll take an increasing amount of damage from the dot. I think Grievous is a frustrating week for Resto Druids, as the playstyle of Druid normally involves trusting your hots to top people over time, to conserve mana and spell usage. However, in Grievous, you'll be forced to spam regrowth on players who aren't even in danger. Make sure your bags are packed with fish feasts and mana potions, and it might be a good idea to grab some mage food for you and your group before you run keys, because for some reason, Grievous doesn't drop outside of combat. Grievous is the one affix where I think Prosperity and Soul of the Forest is actually quite strong, considering you're spamming regrowth constantly, and very often one Swiftmen won't be enough. If you're newer Resto Druid, doing mostly 19s or below, it'd be totally fine to just stick with Cultivation and Cenarian Ward if that's what you prefer. I do, however, recommend Spirit of Preservation Minor for nearly every dungeon, even with those less healing required, just because of the extra boost to your regrowths. Bolstering is mostly a DPS affix, however as a healer you can definitely do your part to help. You should always be prioritizing single target damage this week, focusing on the highest health mob in the pack so that they all die as evenly as possible. Improper management of bolstering is a massive time loss that can be unrecoverable in certain situations. In general, it's important to have a plan for some of the trouble packs in the dungeons with lots of small mobs. Now let's look over some dungeons. I'm just going to go over each one briefly so you have an idea of what you're getting yourself into when you step into a high key this week. First, let's look at Atal. There's two main problems with Atal. The first is Volcall. Volcall on Grievous will be a little more difficult, but I think you can manage it with proper mana management, especially with a good use of Innervate and 2 usages of the Mott Trinket. In general, I think you shouldn't need to spec specifically for this boss. However, if you are really worried about it in a high key, you could run Lucid Major or Formless Major for the additional mana regen and leech. The other hard part will be the Sky Screamer packs with the Swords. The problem here is that the Sky Screamers have 5 times the health as the other Swords, so you need to deal with them in some way, either by heavily prioritizing the Sky Screamers or by CCing them and pulling the Swords away. You can hibernate the Sky Screamers, but keep in mind hibernate is an in-combat CC, so they'll still get bolstered if there's Swords nearby. Overall, I would just be running my normal Essence setup and my normal talent setup in this dungeon. I think this is a relatively easy week for Freehold. Freehold is generally not too tough of a dungeon. There's not going to be any really big trouble packs that you run into. The most difficult part might be the second boss. Captain Eudora will be active, so the additional Grievous damage on top of the shots will be hard to deal with, but ultimately won't be too bad because it's fortified. All in all, I think this is a mostly safe dungeon where if you just go through the dungeon cleanly, you should be able to time it with no crazy boss fights or trash pulls that you need to worry about. This is a dungeon where I'll be running my normal Essence setup, but I will consider changing to Prosperity and Soul of the Forest just for the extra single target healing. King's Rest actually isn't too bad this week as well. There's a few trouble packs with bolstering, namely the Minions of Zool in the first couple of rooms and the Slime Room. You make sure you need to have some plan with how you deal with these. Don't let these mobs get pulled into other big health mobs, or it can be almost an immediate wipe. The hardest parts will be dealing with all the fortified trash on the bridge. It's a really good idea to skip this pack because it can be not only tough with bolstering, but it's just hard on fortified in general with the double casters and the berserker. The amount of healing that you need to bring for this dungeon is going to be based on Zool. If you have a tank that's really survivable to Zool, like a Vengeance, Demon Hunter, or a Blood DK, you can maybe get away with higher damage in here. But if you're playing with a Prot Warrior, you generally want to play with a lot of healing. The last boss can be a little difficult with Grievous as well, so don't go too crazy on spending your mana. This is a dungeon where I'm going to be running my normal talent setup, but with Soul of the Forest and Prosperity as well. Shrine won't be too bad of a dungeon this week as well. It'll definitely be difficult to time, mainly because of these pulls with the Tide Sage Initiates. You have to be really careful in any of these packs that you don't let these small mobs get pulled into big mobs. Usually the way that we like to play it is we pull these first, CC the big mobs that are around them, and then kill the initiates. That way you don't have to worry about them getting chained in later. In general, in Pugs, you should take these areas slowly, but ultimately, if you're a healer, you may be at the mercy of your tank. There's not too much to heal in here, so generally I'll still prioritize damage, even though it is Grievous this week. I'll run my normal Essence setup with my normal talent setup here. Siege can be a really frustrating dungeon this week. There's really not too much to heal. It's mainly just an exercise of bolstering management. However, every single pack back to back is always just small mobs, big mob, small mobs, big mob, in every single pack. The plan that most teams do is they skip as much as possible, and then they do all their trash here in Monkey Town with the spotters. But if you're pugging, you may be at the mercy of your tank with this route. All in all, just hopefully by the time you get to the third boss, you're not super tilted, because this room actually can take some healing, even if you're using the spotter. This is a dungeon where I'm going to be running Prosperity and Soul of the Forest as well with my normal talent Azerite setup. Temple is not too bad this week. It's definitely a big healing check to deal with the third and last boss. However, because it's not tyrannical, the fights won't last too long. The last boss especially will be harder because it actually takes longer on Fortified. Bolstering doesn't affect this dungeon too much. The most difficult part is this room. There's lots of these snakes and riders that patrol circles around the room. So you have to be really careful that you don't pull side mobs. This can be an area where, as a healer, you're trying to stay far away from the tank because of the frontal cleaves and the lightning in a bottle. But if you're too far away, you're going to end up pulling mobs. This is a room where I very often am using Root to stop these snakes from coming in. Keep in mind you can also use Ursals out of combat to turn the mob around and push them away, even if it doesn't put you in combat to use Vortex on a mob. So you can use that to stop patrols as well. All in all, this is a dungeon where I would be speccing very heavily into healing this week. Keep in mind that even if you are heavy healing, it'll still save you some time on the last boss, being able to heal the avatar quickly. So it's not too big of a time loss to run super heavy healing in here. This is where I would run my normal talent setup, but I usually prefer Formless Major here because I can steal Lucid, or if I don't have a Lucid to steal, I would just run Lucid myself for the third and fourth bosses with the normal talent setup. Motherlode is going to be a nightmare this week. Like Siege, it's going to be mostly an exercise of bolstering control. There's not a whole lot that you have to do here as a healer. Mainly in this room, because it's fortified, a lot of these trash mobs are going to hit for 80 to 90% of people's health. So make sure you're topping people right away. If someone takes a little damage from their eye and then starts getting Grievous and then gets Thug Charged, they're just going to die. So in general, you just have to be a heal bot for almost all of this part, keeping people topped. But it usually isn't too healing intensive. It's just more an exercise of not getting tilted by all the bolstering and trying to keep people topped through them standing in their eye. In general, this is not a very good week for Motherlode, and you may see high keys timed if they're executed very well, but all in all, I wouldn't expect to do a good Motherlode run in a pug or a low organized group this week. I would be running my normal Essence and Talent setup here, but you could run Soul Prosperity if you wanted to. Underrot, I think, is about an average week for this. Fortified makes all the bosses a little bit easier. However, Grievous makes them a bit harder. I think they're all still healable, so you shouldn't worry too much about the bosses. The hard part for sure on every Fortified week is going to be this room here. It's a matter of dealing with it quick enough, but at the same time safe enough. You can't combine these Blood Swarmers at all because they're so lethal, so you have to do this room in essentially 5 pulls. and you can't really chain it this week because of bolstering, so this room is going to end up being a time loss. In general, it's a good idea to pull some of this other stuff along with these mobs. That way you're at least getting an extra count from having to do 5 pulls in this room. As a healer, I don't generally spec too heavily on Underrot just because I think it's healable with the normal kit. Depending on what you're worried about, you could run Soul Prosperity if you're more worried about the Bloodswarmers, but Cultivation and Cenarian Ward are going to be better for the boss fights, and in general, I'm going to be running my same Essence setup as well. Tol Dagor actually isn't too bad. It can be difficult to live the bosses, but again, it's fortified, so it shouldn't be too bad. In general, you're getting a lot of your count from outside here. You have to be careful not to bolster this stuff too bad, but at the end of the day, the respawn point is right here, so if you get 20% outside, it's not too bad. This is another dungeon where you can get away with Crucible Major, but you could run Formless or Lucid as well. There's not really too many pulls in here that are real difficult for bolstering. You do have to be careful, for instance, when you pull these looters in with the thug that patrols, you just have to make sure your prio damage. Again, it's not always something you can control as a healer, but just something you want to keep in mind. In general, in Tol Dagor, I would just be running my normal Essence and Talent setup here. You can switch your Major to Formless or Lucid if you're worried about the bosses. Might be a good idea. I don't recommend Soul Prosperity. I think you may have problems healing the first boss without Cultivation. And Cultivation's even pretty good for the last boss as well. Next, let's look at Waycrest. Waycrest can be pretty difficult this week. The trash already hits really, really hard, and Grievous is only going to make it hit harder. Grievous is also going to make the boss fights a little tougher, but again, it's fortified, so you should be able to get through them. The slowest part here is the courtyard, because you have to deal with these dogs that have 20% of the HP of the big witches, and as well as Rawl's room, so you have these revelers that have half the HP as the other mobs. In general, I'd recommend pulling these areas a little bit slower than normal. We've tried some strats where you CC a lot of mobs in here, and in general, it usually doesn't work very well. So I would say this is just not a great week for Waycrest, just because you have to be pulling the trash slower. But it's going to be fun to heal. There's going to be lots of healing required. So in Waycrest, I run a full healing setup with Ever Rising Tide Major, and then the same minor essences here. And as a talent setup, this is what I'm running as well, just my normal talents. Junkyard it's always a good week for Junkyard. Bolstering doesn't impact this dungeon too much, considering that the slime replications don't bolster, as well as the tiny little grunters. So there's not too many pulls that are really nasty with bolstering. Grievous can make stuff a little bit harder, but at the end of the day, all the packs die in 30 seconds with zap bots anyway, so my strategy here is usually to just spam infinite heals and live. I don't believe the big flying thing is over top of Gunker this week, because I think it was there 2 weeks ago, but I might be wrong on that. In general, I change around my Azurite and my Talent and Essence setup quite a bit here. I run ERT Major with the same minors, just because I'm able to spam healing to deal with the trash packs and top everyone from Grievous, and because the damage from healers doesn't really matter too much. And then in that same vein, I'll usually run Guardian Affinity, although I've been having some problems with the movement speed reduction, so if you wanted to stick with Feral Affinity here, it's fine. Also, I'll run Mass Root occasionally, just to help with the bots on the last boss, since there's not too much utility from Typhoon. And last, we have Workshop. Workshop isn't too terribly tough this week. Grievous will definitely make the boss fights harder. The most difficult part for bolstering is this area right here outside of Cujo's room. You have these slimes and then the dogs that have 10 times more health than them, so you definitely cannot pull these together. For this reason, I like to run Mass Root in this dungeon, just in case if you're trying to pull this stuff together and the slimes get pulled, you can actually just Mass Root all the mobs together and then pull these big ones out individually and just keep these mobs Mass Rooted indefinitely until you deal with the big mobs. Then you can just deal with all the slimes by themselves, since you don't really get much use out of Typhoon. In terms of a major essence, because this is a newer dungeon, I'm still up in the air with how to heal this. There's a lot of different ways you can go about this. The classic setup of Crucible Major will be great for time. It'll give your team a little more room to make errors because sometimes things happen in this dungeon. It saves a little bit of time in the dungeon. However, if you're worried about burst healing, for example, the short out bots in this room right here in this gauntlet, or the vent jets in the first boss, you could run Ever Rising Tide Major. You just have to keep in mind that you're going to run out of mana quickly if you're running Ever Rising Tide. Early on in the season, I was running Ever Rising Tide in here just to help with the burst healing before my healing power got high enough. Another option is Lucid Dreams or Formless Major. This is to help with mana, mainly for the last boss. So depending on what you're worried about, if you're worried about the short out bots here or the vent jets, you could try Ever Rising Tide Major. If you're worried about last boss, you might want to try Formless or Lucid. And if you've got a few tries in the dungeon and you're confident and you just want to go for time, Crucible is a good option as well. And that's it. That wraps up every dungeon this week. Thanks for watching. My goal is to make one video for each set of affixes this season. That way there'll be a library of advice for each week in the season of Mythic Plus. Remember, you can catch me live at twitch.tv/yummytv. Happy keying.